welcome. Quote Me on That podcast is an initiative of Quote This Woman Plus. Quote This Woman Plus, also referred to as QW Plus, is a gender justice organization that links women plus experts to the media. Quote Me on That introduces our Women Plus experts to the world. Welcome. Today's guest is Dr. Zakeera Docrat, a forensic and legal linguist, and I want to say language rights researcher, and a 2022 Quote This Woman Voice of the Year awardee for social development and communications, that category. Dr. Docrat's work sits at the powerful intersection of forensic and legal linguistics and justice in a country with 11 official languages. I suppose there's a critical question to be asked is that if you can't understand what is being said to you within the legal framework, then does that really truly serve you? And in this conversation, we'll explore how linguistic exclusion reproduces inequality and how we begin to dismantle it. So welcome,
Thank
Zakeera.
you very much, Renee. Thank you very much for having me.
It's wonderful having you here. I'd like you to start with your background. Like, where did your love for linguistics come from?
I think, Renee, for me, it's when we hear forensic linguistics, first of all, I'm left explaining to a lot of people what is forensic
Yeah.
linguistics. My favorite line is to run with, I'm not from CSI or anything like that. So it's not that glamorous in
Yeah.
that sense. But yeah, and that too, when that term linguistics, and it's used so loosely when
Yeah.
somebody like me just doesn't. I don't have a degree in linguistics. I've got a degree in African languages, but because of the name of the discipline, that's where I find myself in. But yeah, a love for a language in a sense, I think it started when I was a small child. I grew up in my mom's florist business,
Mm.
and the majority of her customers were Xhosa speaking. And obviously, I grew up in Makanda, formerly Grahamstown in the Eastern
Yeah.
Cape. So I had this rich culture that surrounded me in a sense, and that I was exposed to on a daily basis. And having somebody talk to you in a language other than your mother tongue is quite hard at times. And, because you're not just communicating using words, but you're also communicating in somebody's culture, basically. I'd like to say that, or across two different cultures.
Yeah.
So it was always interesting for me. And as a child, I think I just found it very fascinating that I was able to respond and pick up on various phrases and words, and so it developed, and it was encouraged, and my parents both speak isiXhosa fluently, so from that perspective I had that advantage as well, so they encouraged it. And then within my home environment, of course, with our housekeeper and our gardener, who I always say is integral to a part of my extended family, because those are the very people that you grow up with, in a sense, and they encourage that love for a language. So our housekeeper, Shamshi, unfortunately passed away when I was a kid still, but she would say everything to me in isiXhosa and then repeat everything to me in English, so I would understand. So I
Okay.
had that dual medium growing up.
Yeah.
And I just loved it, you know. When you do something and you get that warm, fuzzy feeling. And for me, that was it. Just communicating with somebody in another language and just seeing their face light up at the fact that somebody else outside of their culture could
Yeah.
speak their language. But on a more serious note, Renee, it's worrying in a sense that when I say the story or I tell the story, people would say to me, "Oh, okay, well, so you speak isiXhosa, that's fantastic. Why?" And I look and I think, how do I answer that question? Because isiXhosa is the language of my province. It's the language of my birthplace. So it's inherent of who I am. So why is it always strange to say that, look, I can speak isiXhosa? It shouldn't come as a surprise. Especially, I think in the introduction, you said, "I've got 11 official languages."
Yeah.
So for me, yes, it belongs to somebody else in terms of their culture,
Mhm.
but it belongs to me as well because I'm here. It's part of my fabric, it's part of my makeup. And I think as a South African, I would say if you can't speak another language other than English, then are you truly South African? And that's the question I always pose. So that's how my love really started. And it was just perpetuated. I did it at school. I ended up doing it in matric. And then I went to university. I studied it there on a more intellectual level. So although I'm a second language speaker, it's very nice to say, look, I have that ability to have mother tongue competency. And I think you see things totally different. So to be an Indian child in a sense in the Eastern Cape and to say that I can speak isiXhosa, I think for me that is, that's been the greatest achievement so far of my life.
That is amazing. I mean, like you rightfully said, I pointed out the 11 official languages, and we don't really see people trying to do. Okay, I don't want to generalize. People do. There
Yes.
are people who speak, but it's not something that, like you speaking about, it's being kind of fueled or encouraged, or so we need to see a bit more of that. And you're totally right. When you're speaking, I'm like, well, yes, we are on the soil. It is part of who we are, and we should be
Yeah.
embracing it. So thank you so much for sharing that. What would a truly multilingual system look like to you? I mean, we speak about having these 11 official languages, but it's not kind of interwoven everywhere. You'll have little pockets of,
Mm.
and basically a system that honors people's right to understand and to be understood. What would that look like?
I think, without sounding negative on the podcast, we've digressed from, that constitutional ideal for me of using our languages on an equitable, on an equal basis, depending on what language you want to choose. Obviously,
Yeah,
that term is always problematic, but we
it's
don't. We don't use our languages equally in spaces. And I think, it to start off with, parents don't encourage their children to learn their mother tongues. So when you go into the schooling system, you're essentially losing your mother tongue where that mother tongue is not English, obviously. And that is very sad for me.
Mhm.
And I think it's also about the value that we ascribe to English. So we often put markers on how we sound, the vocabulary we use.
Mhm.
And I think as soon as you don't have a specific accent, or you don't sound a specific way, or you don't use a higher chord of English, then suddenly, intelligence is measured according to that, which is, I think, is the biggest load of nonsense,
Mhm.
because it's untrue. I mean, that's a
Yeah,
fact. So for me, the ideal system is for us to use our languages in various spaces equally. But it starts in the home, it starts within the community. And I think an older generation needs to play that role. And within, obviously, for me, talking about it in the legal system and the legal spaces, that would mean going into court and having equal access. You and I speak English at a highly proficient level. And if it's your mother tongue, you don't have an issue when we enter court. So
yeah,
we already faced with one disadvantage when we enter court. It's a legal setting. And for those people who are not well versed, it's threatening, it's scary. And now to add another layer to that, suddenly you're not being understood
yeah,
and you're not understanding either. And you're solely reliant on an interpreter. And not to take anything away from the important jobs that the interpreters do within our system, because
yeah,
without them, the system would fall to pieces. But the interpretation is often of a poor quality. So for me, that ideal system would be I can access the legal system, I can access justice, and this would be from the police right through to the end of judgment and sentencing, to say it happened in my mother tongue, especially where it's in a province where the majority of the people speak that language. And that for me is accessibility. It's practical and it's equal. And I think we've moved to a system to place English on this, this hegemonic position, and we've downgraded our languages to a sense to say, look, it only belongs in your home in an
yeah,
informal setting, which is unfair.
yeah,
And we also put a price tag on our languages to say it's too expensive to use languages other than English in the court system. It would become too cumbersome. And then, Renee, there's always the race factor
Mhm.
that's associated with language. And this is why at the beginning I specifically made that
Mhm.
comment to you, because for me, language is not associated with race. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we start racializing our languages, then we will never find a space in which we can use it equally. We will say this language belongs to that person or that race and so forth. And then it doesn't become our languages collectively as enshrined in the Constitution. We're creating that same apartheid divide, which we are trying to avoid. So this whole argument about saying, look, transformation is accessible, or should I say achieved rather, through the medium of English, is again, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
Because for me, transformation is about equality, it's equal access. And to answer your question without going again on on
Yeah,
a
I
roundabout
love where
path,
you're going. It's fine.
but
Keep going.
but that's it,
Yeah.
it's about going into a police station, recording your statement in a language that you fully understand, and then going to court and giving evidence in that language, being heard directly in that language, being able to understand what the judicial officer is saying in your language without being heard through a third party. And the reason why I say that is because, it's easy to say we've got interpreters,
Yeah.
but within the legal setting, not everything can be interpreted into English, especially from a cultural perspective. So your cultural nuances, the cultural taboos that exist. I know you're going to get into the GBV crisis and so forth in relation to language, but those are all important things that are currently being overlooked, and all because of language.
Yeah.
So we underestimate the power of language and what it really has the ability to do.
Wow.
And what we are doing now, we're not creating an equal society, we're creating an unequal one on the basis of language.
That is incredible. I mean, I haven't even thought, to be honest, about language in the way that you are describing. So I hope whoever's listening is like, what? And just for us to start thinking about it in that way. As you were speaking now, I'm thinking, what would it take for what you are describing? Because if you look at it, I mean, it would mean that all of us would have to go for lessons
Mm,
to understand, to speak to, and I mean, I don't know if everyone has that appetite, but I mean, it would be amazing if that would be possible, especially when you're saying if this is the community that speaks a specific
mm,
language, that you see it there. I know that having been facilitating training, it's always been an issue where they're like, can you not do the training in a language that the majority of those who are attending can understand? But it's like you're
yeah,
saying, then you
yeah,
struggle to find the words because that word
mm,
doesn't exist. So how do you create that? So it's
mm,
it's it's fascinating. I mean, I love the fact that there are people out there that are not only thinking about this, but are advocating for change. So it's amazing. Um, I think I have You've actually already touched on what happens when someone can't access, or the lack of access to legal support in their own home language. Or actually, you've just touched on that. Maybe you could just unpack that a little bit more. So if you could walk us through what happens when someone cannot access legal support in their home language, especially women, rural citizens, and migrants.
mm.
How does that go wrong?
I mean, if we think of it in a rural setting, so, everybody likes to say I'm from the Eastern Cape, so we're rural, but I mean, I disagree with that, but anyways. But if you really go into Eslaleni, which is the communities, the outlying, rural communities, and and we look at, let's say, a woman who has been unfortunately abused. Let's give that example because it's topical and it's what's happening, and I don't think we should be avoiding it or
Yeah,
speaking around it. She goes to a police station and she wants to record her statement. Now, it's in all probability in those areas, the police officer and her share a mutual language,
yeah.
which would be, again, isiXhosa if I use the Eastern Cape as an example.
Mhm.
There's no language communication barrier there that exists between the two of them.
Yeah.
The barrier comes when he or she, as the police officer, has to record that statement in English, because That is what the language of record prescribes, that it be taken in English. So they are having a conversation in their mother tongue, which is in this instance mutual. They record that statement in English. Now, we're looking, Renee, at specific equivalents.
Mm.
If it's if it's a matter relating to sexual abuse, then it's a whole nother dimension because she is not going to directly use specific terminology as you and I would go into a police station and perhaps use the word sexual assault or rape or anything like that.
Yeah,
In African culture, it's taboo in certain cultures. So it would be awkward for her then to communicate this, especially where it's perhaps a male police officer.
yeah,
And if she explains it using the euphemisms, then sometimes it's recorded on that statement as a sexual assault rather than a rape, which is a serious thing. There's a major difference. And when we get to court, there's a discrepancy then between her written statement
yeah,
of what was said and recorded, and she has no knowledge of English. So remember, she's signing that statement,
yeah,
trusting that the police officer put everything in there and recorded it factually correct, which might not be the case now. And then she gets to court again, relying on an interpreter, saying, "But you said X, Y, and Z, and that's not rape."
mm,
And she's still trying to fumble to find the words to, not because she doesn't want to, but because of cultural nuances and taboos. And then we have the interpreter often trying to, fill a cultural and a language gap at the same time. But is that really the role of the interpreter? And how far can that interpreter really go? So these are practical things that are happening. This is what we see coming through cases on a daily basis. I think, it's been made worse now in a sense by emojis and technology and how we interpret those in a police station, or how from an African cultural perspective, those are even coming and appearing in our courts.
Thank you. You're taking me to my next part, which is exactly that. Like, some people think, okay, I'm just sending the emoji. It's just me answering quickly. I'm not even thinking about it. What does that look like? Again, coming to a legal framework. Now I'm showing up, the woman showing up with this type of evidence. And her interpretation or the person's interpretation is completely different from maybe the person who sent it or whatever else.
Mm. That's what I'm saying. The police are just ill-equipped to deal with it. That's the bottom line. It's not an attack on the police or criticism, but it's the truth. It's a
That's
fact.
the gap.
And if our police officers can't actually write a statement down correctly in English, which they're required to do, and they have no language competencies, again, not their fault. We can't expect the police then to be well conversed and understandable of if a complainant comes in with a series of emojis with no text and she says she's being harassed, to say, okay, they turn them away. That's the honest truth.
Yeah.
You get turned away and you get said, well, there's no written communication, there's no verbal text. We don't know what that means. So in those instances, who are we blaming? We need to blame the system.
Yeah.
And we need to, there's a disconnect between us as academics and the justice system. And I think we're at this point where it needs to be bridged to address these types of issues.
It's amazing how, we're seeing things in life advance, but that advancement comes with its own layer of complication by the sound of it. Because, the everyday person doesn't think about the emoji in the same way, where now when we go to court, it's now a completely different story. Or like you just said, maybe I don't even get to court. Maybe I get blocked at a level that, in my community already, because it's like, what are you going on about? It's only an emoji. How do current legal norms in South Africa reinforce colonial language hierarchies, or even like this new things that are coming in now? How does it kind of fit into the system?
I think our whole legislative framework, Renee,
Mm,
all our practices, the way we think, the way we train our lawyers to think, the way our current cohort of lawyers think. And again, I'm generalizing, so
mm,
I don't want people to criticize me. This is not everybody, of course,
yeah,
but a lot of people, the way some of our judges think along the lines of English is the be all and end all
yeah,
of the system. And the legislative framework supports that,
yeah,
excuse me, in a sense. So we have this monolingual language of record policy in South Africa, which dictates that everything in our legal system and court proceedings happen in English. All documents be
Yeah.
submitted in English, all arguments take place in English, questioning takes place in English with the use of an interpreter where needed and so forth. So this is a system that we have in place. These are practices, but these are enforced through legislation and policies.
Yeah.
Excuse me, but that needs to change, obviously. And I don't think we can change it if the very people who are responsible for creating these policies don't want it to change.
Yeah.
That would be the first thing. The
Cheers.
second thing is that I think there is a lot of change happening because I'm painting a negative outlook. The current Chief Justice has said a lot about language and its importance and what she'd like to see happening in the
Yeah.
judiciary. So I think we again at that point where the research is being taken notice of and to say, look, we need to find a way to move forward and how would a revised policy work? I think some people also might feel scared and threatened.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is not the understanding at all. I think, we don't want to remove English. That is not the
Yeah.
point. I mean, English is my mother tongue, so I
Yeah.
wouldn't be advocating for that. But it's not about replacing one language with
Yeah.
another. It's about creating that equality and how we find a way within various provinces to use majority spoken languages. So
Yeah.
it might not look like one policy or one piece of legislation. It might be province specific because
Yeah.
language is not static. So the demographics in the next 10 years might very well change.
Yeah.
Um, so we need to take that into account. And I think this is what also there needs to be an understanding that the policy needs to be taking all this into account when it's being developed. And these policies have to be informed by ordinary people, by academics who are doing research, by the very people that the policy is going to affect, not
Yeah.
some top-down person who's looking in the system and saying this is the best approach.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I was thinking exactly that, your last line. It's about inclusion and making sure that those voices are part, or those people are part of the process. So thank you so much for that. I want to move on to public education and language rights. I mean, you've spoken about the legal framework, but now if you're thinking about public education, very much it's the same scenario, really. Why do you think it's so critical for language rights to be kind of spoken about in that space, and even things to be changed in the space of public education?
I think we're doing children a disservice. We're doing young adults at universities a disservice by not allowing them to learn in their mother tongues, to express themselves in their mother tongues. You think best in your mother tongue. That research has been proven.
Yeah.
And if we find, again, it's about finding spaces, Renee, within the system. So if we allow a learner to express themselves in their mother tongue and then have that interpreted or summary provided in English for other learners to understand where there's no mutual language,
Yeah.
then that still allows the learner the space to use their language and to think in that language. I think that's what's important. But as a teacher, I suppose some teachers might say, look, I'm monolingual, so what do you expect me to do in those instances?
Yeah.
There are ways, like I said, of using various techniques, of using code switching, of using things like translanguaging, that all the educationists and the linguists will tell you about that work in that sector. So again, there are ways of working around it. There are ways of using glossaries to encourage
Yeah.
learners to use it. And I mean, obviously, from a higher education perspective, again, I'm best placed to talk
Mhm.
to that perspective. But if you allow your students to write in their mother tongue, the idea is just to express so much better. And I'll give you an example. So at honors level, I teach the forensic linguistics course.
Yeah.
And some of the students write in isiXhosa their assignments. And I said, well, you're welcome to do so.
Mhm.
And you can use certain terminology in English where there's no equivalent. We have
Yeah.
to allow for. But the explanations that I get for certain terms are fantastic because it's not a direct equivalent, but it's so well explained that I think, wow, I actually end up learning something as well from the students. And the way in which the assignment is written, Renee, in comparison, if you let that exact student write that assignment in English, the student would end up getting a 50%,
Wow.
um, specific because of the quality of the paper
Yeah.
in comparison to a distinction. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And it enables the student is more comfortable in the lecture. Our lectures are online because we're all over the place. The students feel more comfortable. And where the
Yeah.
lecturer is able to use the languages or a student interpret, it works fantastically well. Nobody's excluded.
Yeah.
So from that instance, but you must understand, too, Renee, that certain language policies within universities dictate how we teach and which languages we
Really?
use. So before I spark some sort of a protest from various students, that's not what I'm saying. You have to
Yeah.
comply with your language policy. But I think many universities are adopting these approaches now to trying to find inclusivity while having these language policies that pursue an English-only agenda on the basis of transformation. Very similar to the legal system.
Yeah. Incredible. I'm listening to you because I also lecture part-time and I'm like, I don't know how I would feel. It's again coming back to that, right? Where the individual will sit and go, oh, but my level of comfort on that particular point. So I think it's amazing that you're able to do that for your students. That's incredible. What small practical changes could the legal institutions or media or even education make today to shift language accessibility?
Oh, that's a hard question. Um, I think it's about viewing languages as I'd like to go back to that old reading and thinking of Ruiz, and that was an old academic some years ago in the 1980s.
Mhm.
And, even much later in the 2000s, me as a student learning that work and even up to now, um, about seeing language as a right and a resource
Yeah,
and not problematizing language. Because I think many media outlets are guilty, perhaps, of making languages other than English look inaccessible, difficult. The legal system and profession might be guilty of saying, look, there's no terminology or the African languages are not intellectualized, so we can't use them in high status domains. It would take a concerted effort. We can't expect the education system to be using the languages as we see the mother tongue based education being rolled out, which is a great positive, I think. But it can't happen just in one sector. Um, so the same would apply to our legal system. If I was to say we need to use languages other than English in our courts, we would need to ensure that the graduates coming through university in the next 10 to 15 years are bilingual, are multilingual. So when you get to that level in 20 odd years' time to sit on the bench as a judicial officer, you are fully bilingual within the province in which you're based. And that would be the ideal.
yeah.
And it's not to say that it's sort of like this utopian dream that I have, which, I mean, it is a dream, but I think it's a realistic one if we look at other models, because it's being done in other countries.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if they can get it right in specific countries, there's no reason to say as South Africans we can't. Sometimes our model is more complicated because we have 12 official languages now with sign language, of
Oh,
course. But it's possible, and I think again it's that will for me. The main answer I think to all of your questions so far would be to say, do we want to? Do we just want to sit and talk and have these conversations constantly and try and convince people? But it needs to be a push from all sectors of society to
yeah.
say, this is a deliberate push to mobilize our languages or the speakers of our languages to say we want to enforce our language rights. Again, I'm not trying to start a protest of any sorts, but we want to use our languages in the mainstream, and this is how we want to do it, or this is how we plan to. And I think once we have people in positions of power who support these types of ideas and this line of thinking, then we will get quite far. But as soon as we have an elitist agenda that is being pursued in favor of one language,
Yeah.
then unfortunately we're all fighting a losing battle.
No, I agree with you. I do agree with you. I must say, I've had engagements with the Department of Health, and their messaging is now, coming in different languages. So if they have a campaign, they're trying to integrate, they're trying to make sure that whatever gets to the ground is the ability of for the community to actually communicate in their own language, and that they engage in social media materials or information, educational materials that speaks to them. But it is quite a tall ask. So I do hear
And
you.
and that is so important, Renee, because that's on a community level.
Yeah,
And information like that is critical for communities to understand.
yeah,
So posting information in English is just not going to reach somebody in a rural community who has access to the phone and the internet, but the information is in English. You're
yeah,
back to square one, basically.
exactly, exactly. Thank you so much. Moving on to Voice of the Year. So you were named the 2022 Quote This Woman Plus Voice of the Year in Social Development and Communications. What did that mean to you and your work?
I think it was a huge surprise. I was obviously very honored to be amongst fantastic recipients, I know yourself included, and to be amongst all of you, it was a great honor for me. Um, I also think that it came with a lot of responsibility. I don't know how you felt about that. Perhaps I'm shifting the question to you as well. But it was responsibility to say, look, the spotlight has been shone on the work that you've done so far. So how are you going to find ways to implement what you're trying to do, or take it to the next level?
Yeah,
And I think what Quote This Woman is doing, obviously, is very important work, especially shining the spotlight, Renee, on women's voices. And I think, those awards for me, it just amplified what we are doing in various spaces. And many people didn't even know what we were doing and the important work that was being advanced. And I think it gave a lot of media attention, which is again important in portraying the right narratives, the narrative that we want out there, the narrative that's going to make a difference to one person's life, or 10 people, or 1,000, or 1 million. For me, it doesn't matter as long as it makes a difference to somebody.
yeah,
And that for me was the most valuable thing. I think that the support from a research-based initiative as well after that award was extremely important. A lot more people, the right voices, if I can use that pun, were interested in the research that's being conducted, and how they could use it in the various spaces. So from that perspective, I think it was a major positive and a boost on a professional developmental level for myself, but also just as a young woman researcher in South Africa, I was just having a conversation with somebody, and I said, you know what? There's actually three disadvantages that people don't know of, and a lot of people will disagree with me. But in the space that I find myself in, is that I'm young, I'm under 35, I'm a black woman, and the fact that I am a woman. So, those three things, age, race, and gender, just in the certain space go against you. You are working perhaps 100, not even 10 times, 100 times harder, perhaps than a male colleague in the same space as you, whether in South Africa or internationally, who does to do less than you, and that work is just amplified. And it's quite unfair. And I think this is what I said as well, after I got the award, that this award has suddenly changed that perspective to show, look, this is what women are doing in various spaces. And for me, that was the most important thing, is just to acknowledge that as women, we make an equal contribution, and it's an important one.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Last question. If there was one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with, what would that be?
Hmm. I don't want to make a general comment, and I don't want to make one specifically about language, but I'd like to say to anybody who's watching this, I mean, you do belong in your space, and if you believe in yourself, that's the most important thing. It's not about convincing people that your work is important or that you're important. I think what's important is driving your agenda, knowing that it will make a difference to somebody's life. And for me, that is the goal. It's not about self-achievement or self-preservation in the sense I know we've all got to earn a living, and that's also important. But it's about how you really find your place in society, especially in South Africa, where we are struggling in various sectors to say, look, how can I make a difference, no matter how small that difference is or how big it is, whether it's on a community-based level, whether it's on a national scale. I think we all have an important role to play. And once we acknowledge the fact of the importance of the work we do and try and find other supporters, then it will make such a difference in South Africa. And I think we'll start to move forward collectively. And it's also about, that collective effort, Renee. Not to try and work against somebody, but rather with somebody. That for me is important. I don't know if that was one message or multiple messages, but yeah, that would be my final word in a sense.
Thank you so much. So that was Dr. Zakeera Docrat reminding us that language is not neutral. It is deeply political and central to dignity, justice, and democracy. If you were moved by this conversation, please do share the episode, cite her work where possible, and help amplify the Women Plus creating systemic change where it's most needed. Until next time, speak with purpose, listen with care, and always keep quoting Women Plus. Thank you so much, Zakeera.
Thank you very much, Renee.